Thanks so much for being here. My name is Bethany Davis Noll. I'm the Executive Director of the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center at NYU School of Law, and we're gathering in celebration of Earth Week and in advance of the United States' announcement of its new nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. As we prepare for that announcement, it is important to look at what states have done to address the climate crisis head-on, and to do so in a way that is equitable and just. In our recent report, Follow the Leaders, the States Have Set a Path to Accelerate U.S. Progress on Climate, we cataloged the dizzying and impressive array of state-level commitments to cut greenhouse gas emissions for these last few years. And AGs have and will continue to play a key role in promoting and defending strong policies to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm so excited to say that with us today to discuss these issues are the AGs themselves: Connecticut Attorney General William Tong, Maryland Attorney General Brian Frosh, New York Attorney General Tish James, and Wisconsin Attorney General Josh Kaul. We also have Justin Pidot, the General Counsel of CEQ, with us to provide the federal reaction. AG Ellison did mean to join us today and actually might still Zoom in if he can, but as I'm sure everyone understands, he is busy today. And I thought I would just take a moment to recognize the importance of the work he's done and is doing in pursuing accountability and justice for George Floyd. Okay, so now the roadmap. I'm going to first turn it over to the AGs, and in order to be equitable, I thought we could go in the alphabetical order of the AG state's name. I hope that's okay, everyone. That means Connecticut, Maryland, New York, and Wisconsin. And after that, we'll hear from Justin to give us the federal insights and reactions. We should have time for dialogue and questions. So for all of you in the audience, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A section. Okay, to the AGs first. What I'd like to hear from each of you is, give us a bit about your background or your state's background on these issues and your thoughts on where we go from here. And then you could pass the baton to each other. That'll help maximize the time we have to hear from you all. AG Tong, you're up.
Thank you, Bethany, and thank you for having me go first. William Tong is always last in alphabetical order my whole life, so that Connecticut gets to go first is a real pleasure. Let me also join you in thanking Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison for his extraordinary leadership, his thoughtful leadership in this moment, and I do hope that Keith gets a few moments to join us today. So I don't have to tell the people watching this, and I don't have to tell you, Bethany, and thank you, Bethany, by the way, for your leadership in New York University Law School and the State Impact Center, for being a tremendous resource to our country. But I don't have to tell all of you that we've experienced an unprecedented rollback of our environmental protection infrastructure over the past 4 years. When President Trump was president, and at his direction, there was a wholesale dismantling of the entire Environmental Protection Agency, and much of the regulatory infrastructure and framework and laws and regulations that we all rely on to protect our environment, to safeguard clean air and clean water, to make our water ever more clean, our air ever more clean, and to take on climate change. And I don't think it is an overstatement to say that we still don't know how much damage has been done, and it will take a long time to reverse that damage. But I'm grateful looking at AG Frosh and AG James and AG Kaul and AG Ellison and our many other colleagues who have joined us, that attorneys general have been literally the firewall over the past 4 years for the climate and for our environment. And one place in which Connecticut has been very active is in protecting clean air and clean water. And these AGs in particular have heard me say that Connecticut and New York and Maryland sit at the end of America's tailpipe. And what that means is that emissions that are produced upwind of Connecticut blow downwind through New York into Connecticut and make our air much dirtier, much less breathable than it normally ought to be. And what we rely on is the federal government to enforce the Clean Air Act and good neighbor rules to control emissions from upwind states like our friends in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And the EPA failed to do that under President Trump. And they neglected to do that, requiring us to go into court and to sue to enforce rules that were already on the books. And I'm gratified to say, although I'm gratified to say that we were successful in winning those cases and compelling the EPA to take action to enforce those rules. We're still working on it. It's not done yet, but we shouldn't have to do that work, right? These are rules that were in place for a long time that make a lot of sense to protect our states and our air quality, which also affects water quality, by the way. And that we were called to action to enforce laws that are already on the books is a waste of resources. It makes our states less clean and less safe for our residents, and it draws our energies away from affirmative work that we should be doing. And that's I think where we are now. We need to stop playing defense, and hopefully with this new administration, we'll have to play less defense, and we need to go on offense against the climate crisis. And that's what Connecticut has done in suing ExxonMobil for its role in concealing climate science and deliberately deceiving Connecticut and the American people about the catastrophic effects of climate change and the role of fossil fuels on climate change. Connecticut's case is a straight up consumer protection case. Every state has a quote unquote UDAP law, unfair and deceptive acts and practices laws. Connecticut's is called the Connecticut Unfair Trade Practices Act. And basically our case is very simple. Since the 1950s, ExxonMobil has had a singular role in developing climate science. They knew about climate change. They knew about sea level rise. They knew about the ozone layer. In fact, so much of what we knew and what I learned as a kid growing up in Connecticut was probably due to the science that was developed by the fossil fuel industry. Then at some point, late 70s and the early 80s, they decided, you know what? We're going to stop talking about climate science and we're going to cover it up. And we're going to deny the existence of climate change. And they fired up their considerable public relations, government relations, and communications infrastructure to convince the American people and the world that climate science isn't really reliable. Climate change is not real, and that we shouldn't worry about it, and we should just buy more gasoline. And that's our case, that we were lied to, that ExxonMobil knew they lied to us, and now they got to pay for the damage. They have to disgorge their profits. They have to pay for remediation and for hardening our infrastructure to prepare for the coming changes in climate. So that's where Connecticut is particularly active in those two areas. Again, we don't do this work alone. We do it with our colleagues, particularly the three colleagues you see here today. Much of what Connecticut does, we could not do without them. And with that, I want to turn it over to AG Frosh.
AG Frosh, 1 second. AG Ellison is here. Actually, he came while you were talking, AG Tong. Thank you so much for coming, AG Ellison. We're very grateful to you. And sorry we started without you. We understand you're super busy right now. And
I was late.
Yeah, and you know.
No, I don't mind. I don't mind waiting for. I can go now, or I can go let Brian go. Either one is fine with me.
Okay, great. We'll keep it with the alphabetical order then of by state. Since you're here now, I did want to take a moment to recognize, you know, what AGs, all of you AGs are doing so much for your constituents and for our country, you know, on so many different important issues. And I think, you know, AG Ellison, your work in pursuing accountability and justice for George Floyd just really is something I wanted to recognize today. And we're grateful to you for being here with us to talk about these important issues, even while you're extremely busy pouring your heart and soul into that work. So thank you. Okay, AG Frosh, you're up.
You bet. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bethany, for inviting me. And I want to echo what you said and what General Tong said about A.G. Ellison. He is a giant. What he has done over the past couple of months has been extraordinarily important, not just to Minnesota, but to our whole country. And I am personally very grateful for the work that you've done, and proud to be on the same screen with you, my friend. Well done.
Thanks, brother.
And
Thank you.
look, I'm also very proud to be on the same screen as my three other colleagues, A.G. Tong and James and Kaul. And for generations, Americans have expected their government to protect them from environmental hazards. And sometimes it's failed to live up to those expectations, but year by year and step by step, there's been forward progress. And that progress came to a screeching halt in 2017. Almost 60 years earlier, Harry Truman said, "Selfish men have always tried to skim the cream of our natural resources to satisfy their own greed. And their instrument has always been the Republican Party." Now, I apologize to the Impact Center, which is nonpartisan, but I have to say that it seemed as if the previous administration was trying to prove President Truman right. They slammed the policy engine into reverse, tried to back up over every environmental protection and every person in their way. They refused to enforce and attempted to overturn dozens of rules that protect our climate and, non-incidentally, our air and water. They tried to lift pollution caps, as A.G. Tong mentioned, on cars, on trucks, on utilities, oil and gas operations, on industries, on landfills, and others. And the NYU Impact Center and a number of state attorneys general were, in the first 2 years, the only check against the Trump administration's environmental destruction program. And in the later 2 years, we were fortunate to have the House of Representatives acting as a check as well. But I wanted to just talk about a couple of issues that had particular importance to me. In 1988, I was in my second year as a member of the Maryland House of Delegates, and Exxon and Texaco were exploring for oil in the Chesapeake Bay. And, you know, even though I was still basically a rookie, I introduced a bill to prohibit all oil and gas drilling in the bay. And to the shock of the oil companies, it was enacted. It was horrifying to me 30 years later that the Trump administration intended to open the entire East Coast to drilling, including at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. We were vehemently opposed. The decision by the administration was rushed, it was reckless, it was risky, it was bad for the ocean, bad for the beaches up and down the entire coast, and it was a terrible threat to the Chesapeake Bay, which is the nation's largest estuary and which flushes very slowly. Also, the decision was a needless accelerant to climate change. Our NYU fellow Josh Siegel helped lead a team of attorneys general from Maine to North Carolina, including both my friends on this program, A.G.'s Tong and James. We were determined to prevent oil drilling off the coast. And the first step was to fight against seismic testing, which is a predicate and a precursor to drilling, and itself a grave danger to marine life, especially to mammals like whales and porpoises and dolphins. We fought them to a standstill. The authority for the licenses purported to be granted by the administration expired and they slunk away. On a similar note, I led the efforts in the Maryland General Assembly twice to adopt California's vehicle emission standards. First, when I was in the House in 1991, and again in the Senate in 2007. And as I understand, A.G. Ellison will discuss in greater detail, the second set of California's vehicle emission standards was one of the most important, one of the most effective climate protection efforts in our country. So when the previous administration attacked not only the California standards, but also California's right to set them, I was proud, as I think everybody on this webinar was, to join with California's former Attorney General, now Secretary of Human Resources, Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra, and we were successful in beating back the administration's efforts on that. And these are just a couple of examples of the dozens and dozens of actions that our office took with these wonderful colleagues and others from around the country to protect our air, our water, and our climate from the depredations of the previous administration. We met with great success, much of which would not have been possible without the help of the State Impact Center, and I'm very grateful for that. But we've lost 4 critical years in the struggle to save our planet. There is much work that remains to be done, and I look forward to engaging with my colleagues here and with the Impact Center in the years to come to get that work done. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to the great Attorney General of the great state of New York, Tish James.
I'm going to defer and allow my colleague, Attorney General Ellison, to speak. I know that he has a busy schedule. So A.G. Ellison?
I apologize.
Well, let me just say, it's such a one of my great pleasures is to serve with you all. It really is an honor and a privilege. And you know, at any given moment, sadly, some bad thing can happen in any one of our states, and that puts any one of us in the spotlight at that moment. When George Floyd was tragically taken from us when he was murdered, you know, that put Minnesota in a position where we had to step up and deal. And it was through your inspiration and support that we were able to do that. You know, so I thank you very much. And you can know that whatever's happening anywhere in this country, you know, Minnesota will have your back in the fight for justice. So thank you. And let me just say that, you know, what happened to George Floyd is part of it in a built environment. And the built environment includes a lot of things, fossil fuel burning, cars, all of these things. And Minnesota is endeavored to work very hard to try to make sure we have clean, breathable air for our citizens, consider it to be really important. I will tell you, when William was talking about Connecticut's lawsuit, I was really intrigued because our lawsuit is almost exactly the same. We're suing ExxonMobil, American Petroleum Institute, and Koch Industries, and we're not talking about the science of climate change. We're talking about the deception and the lies, and so that's our theory. So we believe we can definitely prove it. Williams already laid it out well, but you know, the fact is, they knew full well that their product was creating climate chaos and denied it. In fact, had campaigns to say that, oh yeah, you all are chicken littles, or you know, it's not really true. I mean, the documentation is stunning to know that they deliberately misled the public around the effects of their product. So William, thank you for that. But we're also spending a lot of time in Minnesota, along with colleagues around the country, to try to do anything we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that means trying to create markets that are better for electronic vehicles, so that people in Minnesota can breathe a little better. And so our Attorney General's office, we've worked with our fellows, thank you NYU, to really work on supporting the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's work to introduce electronic cars. The states has adopted a rule for new cars that is published now, and it's been adopted, and we're joining other states like some folks on this call that will require automakers to deliver more makes and models of zero emission electronic vehicles to dealership lots. There is a shortage. They need to do it. They can't keep selling us these gas guzzlers and fossil fuel burners. And, it really is an urgent situation. In Minnesota, we have bad air days on a regular basis. We think of ourselves as a green, environmentally friendly state, but for many days in the summer, you get warnings that if you have asthma or are older or have any kind of vulnerabilities, you should stay inside. That does not mix with our self-conception of being part of some great North green state. And so we're working to make it realer. And also, there are very significant impacts from auto emissions, fossil fuel emissions, that we got to really point out impact low income and racially diverse communities particularly hard. In Minnesota, as a statistical matter, Lord knows there's plenty of Black folks who drive cars, but as a statistical matter, fewer African Americans own cars than others. So we're talking about people who don't even drive cars having to breathe the exhaust for people who do. If that's not environmental injustice, I don't know what is. People who are more transit dependent burn fewer fossil fuels than those others. So we are trying to make sure that the markets are open and that for electronic vehicles, it does help. It helps to a substantial way. And we have adopted this rule because it is a bold initiative. Minnesota, sadly to report, is now one of the largest producers of greenhouse gas emissions that's driving climate change. This is not a record we want to continue on. The state needs to slash these emission rates to get back on track with the goals that we set many years ago. We were supposed to hit a key target back in 2007 with the New Generation Energy Act to cut greenhouse gas emissions 15% from between 2005 and 2015. We missed. And now the state is on target to miss again, to cut emissions by 30% by 2025. So we are litigating, we are adopting rules, we are taking this very seriously. As has been pointed out, we have had no partner for the last 4 years in the federal government. Now we have one. That's good news. And we expect to step up our work to a greater and greater degree. And that work is being assisted by our fellows who are working on a range of environmental issues, including this issue of zero emission vehicles. So let me just stop right there and say that it's a pleasure to be on with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith, and thank you for all of your work. Dr. King once famously said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And certainly yesterday you bended it a little further towards justice. I thank you. It's great to see all of my colleagues here this afternoon. Bethany, thank you in the center for all that you have done. And as has been mentioned, I'll be brief, but I did want you to know that under the previous administration, this group and the group of 25 attorney generals We have brought more than 300 cases against the previous administration. And of those 300 cases, New York has either led and or joined 254 of those multi-state actions, ranging from challenging and or defending the air that we breathe, clean energy, toxins, and other environmental issues. And the help of this great center and this great organization was critical and vital, from your cutting edge research to the sharp legal fellows that were in our office. I truly want to thank you. They clearly advanced our democracy, and their passion for the intersection of the environmental and justice obviously was instrumental in our success. And I, again, want to thank all of my colleagues who are on this Zoom call and the rest of the other members of the 25 Coalition standing up for the environment. And, you know, for me, the issue is simple. Concern for the planet goes back to my days as a city council in downtown Brooklyn, representing families in low-income public housing, a significant number of the children who suffer from asthma. And there was not, one day did not go by where the air in downtown Brooklyn violated the Clean Air Act. And as I've indicated, I keep on my desk the pictures of 2 children who died from asthma attacks as a result of those conditions. And the great irony of it all is that those who don't have the luxury to worry about climate change often feel the brunt of the impact of environmental injustice. And so it's really critically important that individuals understand that this really is an issue about justice and justice for all of us. Climate change is not simply an issue of science. It's about an opportunity for everyone to, again, breathe clean air and enjoy clean water and clean energy. And so we are looking forward again to working with the new administration to reverse a lot of the damage that was caused by the previous administration, from rejoining the Paris Agreement to advancing the health protections, as well as the environment overall. In New York, as you know, Bethany, we passed a Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which basically achieves net zero gashouse green emissions by 2015, amongst other policies. And as was mentioned by AG Tong, as you know, my predecessor initiated litigation against Exxon. It was based on investor protection. Fortunately, we were not successful, but nonetheless, we opened up the door. And it's important that we continue to push the laws forward in the area of our environment so that all of us can advance policies which protect each and every one of us, protect our health, and protect the environment. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague from Wisconsin, the great Attorney General Kaul.
Thank you so much, AG James. First, let me say thank you to the State Impact Center and to NYU for having this event. Thank you, Bethany, for moderating us. It is a privilege to be here with some of my outstanding colleagues. And I want to specifically mention Justin Pidot, who's coming up soon, former law school classmate of mine. It's great to be on this Zoom together. One of the things that I think is really critical as we think about this, and AG James just spoke to this directly, is the impact that climate change is having on communities in our states already. You know, when we talked about this issue a decade ago, I think people were talking about climate change a lot in terms of what would happen. And now we are all seeing what is happening. We've seen the wildfires around the country. We have seen the impacts on water levels. You know, we take a ton of pride in the upper Midwest, where AG Ellison and I, along with AG Noll in Michigan, are. And one of the things we take a lot of pride in is our Great Lakes. And, you know, those lakes are our largest source of water in the country, and they're under threat from climate change. We have all sorts of incredible fishing and recreational activities in Wisconsin that is under attack from climate change. This is having enormous impacts on states around the country and, of course, on the entire planet. And doing something about this now is critical. Now, I want to just remark on a few trends. One is, as you've heard from my colleagues, there was all sorts of litigation during the prior administration on issues relating to climate change. And it really covered the gamut on environmental issues, air toxin issues, national ambient air quality standards issues, the dirty power rule where restrictions on power plants were changed. Also changes to rules in terms of how rules were set. The anti-science rule, we called it, which disallowed the use of certain studies, changes to the national environmental policy reviews. It really was a sweeping attack on policies that were in place, some of which were really long-standing policies and others of which were adopted during the Obama administration. But what I think is really notable is while there was this attack, I don't think the impact of what we saw over the last years in terms of the harm that could have happened was as bad as it could have been. It wasn't as bad as I feared it would be for a couple reasons. One is once you set good environmental climate policy, as happened during the Obama administration, corporate America adjusts to that. They're not going to every year change the way that they are setting their environmental targets, because if they do that, they're going to have too much inconsistency. So having those good rules in place has an impact for years to come. And one thing I would hear from business leaders during the Trump administration, when there was the rollback of the Clean Power Plan, was, even though it might be in our business interest for that to happen, we've already made plans to meet the Clean Power Plan standards, and we're going to continue forward with that. And you see businesses advertising based on their ability to reduce their emissions. So this is becoming an issue where corporate America is really moving ahead in some ways of where our Congress is. The other thing we saw in the Trump administration was that a lot of those efforts to roll back rules failed or were held up in the courts. And you've heard from my colleagues about these suits we were involved in. And here's why it's so important that states are involved in those cases. It's because they are really fact dependent. And being able to show these impacts that we're talking about, how the rollback of these rules is going to impact communities across the country, is really critical in building the kind of factual record you need to be successful in this case. The other reason I think the Trump administration had a lot of trouble rolling back environmental rules is the facts are not on their side. The science is not on their side. And if you issue a rule based on the notion that climate change is not real science, any court that is fairly hearing the evidence is unlikely to find that to be a sufficient basis for rulemaking. So the good news is the rollbacks weren't as bad as I think they could have been. Now, as AG Frosh said before, we also had 4 wasted years where we weren't making progress. And certainly some of the rollbacks did have an impact and will continue to have an impact. But I mention all that because it is critical now in the Biden administration that we take this opportunity to have another leap forward. Because that leap forward will not just last for the Biden administration. I think there's a good chance it will have an impact beyond the Biden administration, however long it lasts. One last thing I want to say, which is a word of caution in the courts. In Wisconsin, we've got courts that have taken a lead in an area where I wish we weren't taking the lead, which is sort of conservative legal doctrine when it comes to restricting the administrative state. We had legislation passed in 2011 that limits what administrative agencies can do. And it's different, but it's a similar concept to this revitalization of the non-delegation doctrine. If that doctrine is revitalized, it's going to have enormous negative consequences in a lot of different areas, but in particular in the environment. So much of the policymaking that happens at the federal level on environmental issues is through administrative rules. We saw that with the Clean Power Plan, for example, and we saw an attempt to reverse that in the Trump administration. If that doctrine is revitalized in a way that stops our EPA from setting rules that we need to protect against climate change, it's going to make it much, much more difficult for us to make progress. And so it's going to be vital that we continue pushing back against those kinds of efforts to undermine the fight against climate change. So again, thank you everybody for having us, and look forward to hearing the questions that you all have.
Wow, it's really an honor to be here with you on day about 80 of my tenure at CEQ. I hear the comments that you've made about my predecessor's work, and we will do better. But Bethany asked me in part to react to the comments you made. In part, I just want to thank you. I mean, you all have really been the bulwark against depredation, I think AG Frosh said, from the last administration. I also think that this is a particularly meaningful moment to spend time with you because first it's Climate Week, which we're celebrating. I think that's sort of the genesis of this talk, but also listening to comments from AG James, AG Ellison, and all of you, recognizing the deep interconnection between climate justice and justice, right? Social justice, economic justice, environmental justice. These are interrelated components of our society and ones that this administration, the Biden-Harris administration, recognizes and is committed to tackling as quickly as we can, although I think as AG Tong suggested, it's going to take some time. There's a lot of work to do, not only to repair the damage, but to take that leap forward, right? We can't squander this opportunity. And hopefully it's apparent from the outside, but if it's not, I'm happy to report that we're ready to roll up our sleeves. Right, this administration has attracted folks from across the country who want to join at this unprecedented moment when issues of environmental justice, climate change, environmental equality are really at the forefront of the national conversation and at the forefront of the president's agenda. That's why President Biden took no delay in resetting federal climate policy. As he promised on day one, the United States rejoined the Paris Accords. Incredibly important component of restoring American leadership at the federal level. The states have been leading, you all have been leading, but federal government's leadership on climate policy. That's also why early in his tenure, the president issued a sweeping and ambitious executive order to tackle the climate crisis at home and abroad. The president deeply believes that tackling the climate crisis presents a valuable economic opportunity to create millions of good paying union jobs, strengthen working communities, and achieve environmental justice. And through these actions, I think you really see the blueprint of the way that President Biden is thinking about climate change. It's also why the president's Americans Job Plan includes historic investments to build resilient infrastructure, ensure clean drinking water for all communities, and deploy clean energy technologies and innovations. We at CEQ play largely a integrating role. We help coordinate federal agencies on pursuing these priorities. And as of last week, we have our leader in place. Chair Brenda Mallory was confirmed last week. She's has extensive experience in the federal government, has been a leader in environmental justice for a long time. I can't tell you how excited we are. As I listened to all of you talk about the last 4 years and the future, the law professor in me started analyzing and creating categories. And so I just thought I would reflect for a moment on what I think are the four truly critical and pivotal roles that you all have played and that you will play in the work that's ahead. First, the last administration provided an unfortunate opportunity for states to once again prove that they are the laboratories of democracy to develop innovative strategies to address the social and environmental issues of our time, including climate change. Obviously, states always play that role, but in the vacuum that was created over the last 4 years, you particularly played that role. And I know that your offices were central to your state's ability to craft those policies and defend them in court. Unfortunately, that often took the form of defending against the federal government, who the prior administration was not only hell-bent on preventing the federal government from addressing climate change, but seemed hell-bent on preventing anyone from addressing climate change. So I celebrate and applaud the work you have done sort of fending off those legal assaults from the federal government. Second, this was picked up in some of the comments, when the federal government fails to affirmatively enforce federal law, states filled that vacuum too. Sometimes by enforcing state laws that sort of were the mirror image or complemented federal environmental law, and sometimes directly suing to enforce federal law. I have fewer comments on federal enforcement, because this administration is committed to letting the Department of Justice and the federal enforcement agencies take the lead. We saw, I mean, there were many shortcomings of the last administration. One was the political meddling from the White House and the Department of Justice, and that has stopped and will stop. You know, I am hopeful that we will return to a robust enforcement program. I anticipate that that will be the case, but that is not my call. That is not the White House's call. That's the call of the Department of Justice and the good folks who were there, scattered across the country in U.S. attorneys' offices and in Maine Justice. Third, certainly we've heard a lot about the critical role states have played suing the federal government in the last 4 years. When we ignored science, shortchanged public participation, ignored the constraints of federal law, built arbitrary records, acted too fast. I mean, we could spend the rest of our time just cataloging some of the shortcomings that have happened. A.G. James mentioned 300 lawsuits that were brought by states. In Bethany's former life, she did some research on the success rate of the federal government in those and other lawsuits and revealed a staggering loss rate of federal government prevailing in less than a quarter of the lawsuits brought against it for agency actions like regulations and guidance documents. Now, in a former life, I was a Department of Justice lawyer for the United States, and I can only say that it is a staggeringly low success rate. I mean, I was at DOJ sort of during the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. I think we were winning about 3/4 of our cases. Now, there's also a cautionary tale there, which goes to the question of how quickly can we move. You know, the Trump administration's failures in court were in part because they moved in a fashion that was that ignored the constraints of federal law, didn't pay attention to building records, ignored public participation, all of these things which take time. And so while we are committed to moving quickly, we're also committed to moving deliberately. You know, this administration is committed to the rule of law, to making sure that we take the time necessary to build records that can support the decisions that we make. Because if we rush ahead and do so in a fashion that opens us up to litigation risk that we will not be able to sort of meet, we really haven't leapt forward. We simply remain static. Third, or fourth, and finally, states have a critical role to continue being our partners in the years ahead as we re-enter the regulatory space. Right, we will be looking to you to help us shore up our records, to providing important comments, feedback, partnership as we craft federal policy that can withstand the test of time, that can be durable. And we will be looking to states, tribes, local governments, citizens, scientists, engineers. I mean, there's really, this is an all hands on deck moment for climate change, for environmental justice. It's why the president has articulated a whole of government approach. But this is really a whole of world approach, right? This is a moment when each of us have a part to play, both using the authorities that we may independently have, whether it's a local, state, tribal government or an entity, but also just work in collaboration to develop policies that can sort of both achieve climate justice, improve American sort of job prospects, economic opportunities, sort of really recognize and take advantage of the synergies here. I guess I'll just end by saying, you know, we look forward to the chance to work with all of you. You know, this is a terrific conversation. I took copious notes. If you saw me looking to the side, it's because I have my little handy notebook next to me where I jot down people's thoughts. And so I just really am grateful for your leadership and for the chance to be here with you today.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you to AGs Tong, Frosh, Ellison, James, and Kaul so much for bringing your experience to this conversation and your hard work to this effort, and to Justin for courageously being prepared to respond to all of that. You know, there's some questions in the Q&A, and you know, this kind of I'm building a question that's like a meld of the themes that are out there and the themes that you all raised and the questions. And so what I want to ask is, I want to hear your thoughts on what specifically can be done to build an equitable transition to addressing the climate crisis, you know, in particular, building jobs in communities that need the most, the communities that have been overburdened by pollution. can you give us ideas of specifics of on that front? And anybody can volunteer.
I'm happy to jump in quickly with the vision the president has articulated in that executive order I mentioned. You know, it wasn't just about climate. It also is about just transitions. He's created a task force to focus on how we can help communities that have relied on fossil fuels or other resource bases that are perhaps in decline transition to more sustainable green jobs. And so I think an investment both of attention and resources in that task is critical. And then the other second part I'll mention is the EJ40 initiative that the president has articulated, directing federal agencies to direct 40% of their federal investment to EJ communities to try to address some of the, it'd be a small step forward, but a meaningful step forward to really invest in communities that have been overburdened by pollution.
So let me just say this, this is really in response to what Justin just laid out earlier, and that is partnerships are obviously going to be key to addressing climate change. And it's really critically important that now with the new administration, that states work very closely with the federal government in regards to those partnerships. And in New York, as I mentioned in the outset, we just recently passed a new bill with respect to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. But it's also important to know that we are also investing in clean energy solutions, such as wind and water and energy efficiency and energy storage. And that will, again, generate a significant amount of jobs, particularly in those areas which have, unfortunately, there's been great divestment and have been underfunded. It's really critically important that we move to a just transition, that we move to a green economy, and that we talk about those issues in communities, given the fact that a significant number of individuals in low-income communities believe it's a luxury to focus on a green economy and to focus on energy efficiencies. And I think that is what is so critically important. It's also important to understand that in the bill that was passed in New York, 35% of the savings will be invested in those communities. And that is what is really critically important. So partnerships, what we can do on a state level, going forward, and obviously using our office as a bully pulpit to talk about the benefits of a green economy.
Let me just follow up on what AG James said, and thank you, Justin, for those remarks. We've said, this group has said over and over again, there's so much work ahead of us, because even if the Trump administration broke every rule and every norm to achieve their policy goals, that doesn't mean we will. And that's why there's so much work ahead of us to reverse the damage that's been done, particularly through administrative law and through the agency and rulemaking process, which is long and cumbersome and litigation-like. And by the way, industry, and particularly the fossil fuel industry, will be there to meet us at every turn. And so I just hope everybody is ready and girds for the coming, procedural grind out that we have to go through to reverse a lot of these changes. I appreciate what AG James said about the bully pulpit of attorneys general. We do have a bully pulpit. It's effective, but it's a bully pulpit. And AGs, though we have a lot of important tools in our toolbox, they're specific, often legal tools in our toolbox. And AG James is a former city council person, so she knows, a lot of the impact and of adverse consequences of environmental and climate changes visit upon local communities. And the burden is borne by local communities and local governments. And I don't think that we hear enough from mayors and city councils and first select people. And I don't think they know enough, or are not, I hesitate to say not educated enough, but there's not enough policy focus, I think, on the local level on how dramatic an impact these changes have on municipal budgets and quality of life in cities and towns across the country. And so one thing we can do is spend our time. It's great that you're focusing on us. We want you to focus on us, but we really have to move resources in, making sure that our future mayors and first select people and city council leaders, that they focus on these issues and that they focus their resources on climate change and on adaptation and hardening their infrastructure and reversing the effects of climate change.
And just lastly, let me just make a point. These last 4 years, we've had to step up and defend states' rights and defend the environment. But, as the Biden administration, as the Biden administration puts forward an infrastructure bill, all of us need to be vigilant because it could serve as a threat to natural resources and to all of the issues that we care about. So although we're taking our foot somewhat off the pedal and going in reverse, and although we do have a relationship with the Biden administration, we still have to be diligent, and we still have to keep our eyes on all of the policies from this administration. By no means do we have to live, breathe, and engage in daily discussions with respect to the federal government, but nonetheless, we can't keep our eye off the prize.
We're gonna quickly run out of time. So I had one last kind of lightning round question that I wanted to ask each of you. And that was just to shift gears a tiny bit, just on a personal level, what is it that each of you thinks about? What's the value that drives you, that you would say is your reason for doing this work? And we could go in the order that we went in before, if that makes it easy.
You want us to start in the order we went before?
Yeah, that puts you on the spot. I'm sorry.
No sweat. It's really personal for us. And I spent, before this call, I talked about our immigration work, which, by the way, is done with this same group of AGs. And you could tell the same story about the tremendous damage done to our immigration system over the last 4 years and how much work there is ahead. My parents are immigrants. I struggled with asthma and allergies and breathing as a kid. And my parents worked 7 days a week, 15 hours a day in our Chinese restaurant. And they didn't know about the healthcare system. They didn't know about asthma. They didn't know about air quality. They just knew that they had to get up every morning and gut out another day, right? And provide for our family. And I'm reminded that I was probably lucky. And there are so many kids like me who live in urban communities, the children of immigrants, who weren't as fortunate as I was to grow up in the Hartford area in Connecticut and have parents who worked really hard and got lucky and were successful, who also suffer from breathing issues and asthma, and who live in Brooklyn, right? I mean, how many Asian American families like mine live in Brooklyn? And our AG James's neighbors and constituents, and they don't know about the healthcare system. They don't know about the causes of asthma and lead poisoning and air quality. They just know they got to get up in the morning and work. And if they don't, they're going to be in deep trouble. And so I think of them, and that's why I do this work.
So for me, the overarching concern, and I guess the sharpest instrument that I have to use as an attorney general is the fight for justice. There are people, most people in our country don't have the ability to speak for themselves on issues that impact them on a daily basis, that threaten their welfare. And throughout my time as Attorney General, we've tried to focus on issues where people are taking advantage of folks who are not well-to-do, or I mean, it astonishes me that every time low-income people manage to accumulate a tiny bit of wealth, industries grow up that seek to take it away from them. And so I think that's the overarching principle for me as an Attorney General, but also with respect to the environment, I love being outdoors. I'm a biker. I'll walk if I have to, but I'd much rather be on a bike. And that's been true pretty much my entire life. And Maryland is just a stunning example of beauty and resource when it comes to the environment. And I'm always struck by a passage from John Smith's diary when he first sailed into the Chesapeake Bay. And he wrote, we found an abundance of fish lying so thick with their heads above water that for want of nets, our barge driving amongst them, we attempted to catch them with a frying pan. But we found it a poor instrument to catch fish with. Neither better fish nor more plenty nor more variety of small fish have any of us ever seen so swimming in the water, but they're not to be caught with frying pans. And to me, that's a magical image. It's you sail into a body of water that is a carpet of fish. In the days when he explored the Chesapeake Bay, the oyster reefs crested the waves and were a danger to navigation, of course. And we've depleted those resources so terribly, so dramatically. Oysters used to filter the entire Chesapeake Bay in 3 days, and they've been reduced to less than 1% of their former numbers. The bay is terribly polluted, but still vibrant. And we're trying to do everything we possibly can to save the last vestiges of that vibrancy. And that is one of my primary motivators in the context of environmental issues.
I'll be quick. I continue to think of those 2 girls that died from asthma attacks. I continue to think of the days when my father took me fishing in upstate New York in the Hudson River, which unfortunately there are bodies of water that we can no longer fish in. My father has gone on, but I cannot bring my nieces and nephews upstate to fish anymore. I think of Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and I think of all of the children who were impacted by Hurricane Sandy. But what I think about most is I think of environmental justice in terms of justice, but also in terms of economic development and the ability to create high-paying jobs. And so we cannot return to normalcy after this pandemic. And so it's really critically important that we transition to high-paying jobs, and high-paying jobs can be created in this green economy. And that's what we've got to talk about. That's what we've got to push. That's what we've got to lobby. And that's why we've got to use the rule of law, both as a sword and as a shield. Thank you.
And I'll be brief as well. It's great to hear those comments from you all. And let me just add, as you've heard about, this is about the health of the people in our communities. There are enormous health consequences from pollution. It's about the quality of life in our communities, people engaging in traditions that their families have been part of, in some cases for generations, and exploring the outdoors and doing all sorts of different kinds of recreation. It's about our economy, because when there is lead that's poisoning the water, or there's PFAS in the water, that can devastate a community's economy. And it's about the legacy that we're leaving our kids. I mean, this is a big part of that. And leaving them with the kind of opportunities that generations before have had means leaving them with a planet that is safe and free from a drastic shift in the climate.
2 quick thoughts, one image and one more personal. I think often about the fact that in the heart of this pandemic, the recommendations from the CDC were to wash your hands, and yet many people in the Navajo Nation did not have running water in their homes. So the confluence of issues, and I live in Arizona right now. I have to figure out how to move back to DC shortly, but that's close to my heart and close to home, is thinking about how these issues impact tribal nations and just the dramatic intersections. On a personal front, the Trump administration was a dark day for me personally. I was at the Interior Department at the end of the Obama administration, saw all the work that we had done unraveled. And nonetheless, my wife and I decided to have a daughter last year before the election. And at that moment, I redoubled my own personal efforts because it was sort of an act of hope in a moment when despair was too easy to see. So, I mean, I'm thankful to all the work that you all have done, keeping hope alive so that we could be your partners picking up the baton on the federal side.
Thank you so much, AGs Tong, Frosh, James, Ellison, and Kaul. You bring an incredible diversity of experiences and insights to these issues, and we're so grateful, as Justin said to you, for keeping hope alive. The points you all made are powerful and important reminders as we face this coming climate work. Justin, we're gratified by the support as well as the care you're taking in thinking about these issues. What I'm hearing is a call to action. Everybody needs to participate and contribute to this work. To all of you out there, thank you so much for being here. We hope this has been enlightening and inspiring to you all. Please join me in thanking the AGs and Justin for this fantastic discussion. I appreciate all your time today. Thank you.